gente sobre como construir um site de e-commerce com AMP, eu acho que vai ser bem legal. O Ben, ele tem uma banda que é super legal, chama Ancient Babies, right? I think I got it right, from last year. Ele tem uma banda, então ele poderia estar tocando a própria música dele aqui. Então acho que vai ser bem legal, confiram aí. Bem-vindo, Ben!
You're playing my song. Thank you very much. And there's my talk. Look at that. Hi, sorry, my Portuguese, all I can say is obrigado. I can say desculpo. And I'm walking I say desculpo, no Portuguese. So I must talk in English. I apologize for that. But I'll try to talk clearly. I tend to talk too fast. If I'm talking too fast, just say, hey, that was too fast, and I'll remember and slow down. So hi, my name is Ben. My topic is how to build an e-commerce site with AMP, with some emojis afterwards, because emojis are fun. And this is me over here. My job involves working at Google. I'm a developer advocate. My job is to help the web be fast and be good and beautiful for users and also for developers as well. And as part of that, I do work on AMP. But before I talk about that, I saw these really cool trees yesterday, and this is not really my topic, but is that called a banyan tree? Or baobab tree? I thought it was called a banyan tree. If I'm wrong, tell me later on, because I guess it's a tree that can actually make these make roots that come back up and become branches, and come back and form roots and make more trees, and it can grow everywhere. You're nodding your head, so I hope that's correct. I thought this was really cool because when I was a child, I read this really cool book or story called Hot House about the future. And it's the future where the sun has gotten closer to the Earth, and it feels like half the sky. And also the Earth's rotation has changed, so one half is always facing the sun, kind of like the Earth and the moon. So one half of the Earth is always facing the sun, and that half gets a lot of sun energy. And so all the plants have gotten very big and very powerful. And plants are walking around, and they're seeing things and doing things. And plants are eating humans, too. And humans have gotten really small, and they're all green. And the point of all this is that banyan tree covers the entire Earth as part of that book. So it's already happening here in Brazil. Anyway, all that aside, you may be saying, what is he talking about? Or this slide's actual purpose is to say, okay, I know what AMP is a little bit. I've heard of this AMP thing. I've heard it's used to build these simple sites for publishers, and maybe Google likes it for some weird reason. But why do you want to build an e-commerce site with this thing? You must be a crazy person, which is possible, but that's not what we're here to talk about either. We're talking about this guy over here. This guy, his concern is that he's trying to load your mobile site on his phone, your website, but it loads slowly. And everyone here knows probably that performance matters a lot, especially on mobile devices. And if your site loads slowly, people aren't going to like it as much. If it loads slowly, they might just leave before doing anything. See this guy waiting for your site to load. He's so upset, he's taking up smoking. And he's been drinking beers while waiting for it to load. So his life will be shorter. It's your job to make his life longer by making your site load more quickly. That isn't just this one person. There are numbers that back this up. I'll do this very briefly, but this was a study done by DoubleClick using Google Analytics data a couple of years ago, showing that half of people would just leave a site that didn't load in 3 seconds. So 3 seconds is pretty fast, but last year I was looking at numbers, and this year the numbers are that the average site takes 12 seconds to become fully loaded over 3G. 12 seconds. It was 19 seconds last year, which is even longer. It's gotten a little better, but most sites are still too slow. You may say, well, my website, though, my users all have 4G. Well, it's possible your users all have 4G. They're all in nice cities where Wi-Fi is very fast. They all use brand new, really expensive phones that run JavaScript quickly. But it's not true of a lot of people. A lot of people don't have good access to Wi-Fi. They might have 2G or 3G in rural areas in various countries. And in fact, the latest thing that I saw showed that 40% of people access things over 2G still in the world. So if your goal is to build for everyone to use your site, it's better to make things faster, I think, at least. And it turns out that in Brazil, there are some companies that have been using AMP for e-commerce and doing very well. We see this actually more in Brazil than almost anywhere else I can think of. So for example, Turo over here, they made some of the landing pages, AMP, and they saw some shocking improvements in their metrics over here. A lot more people opened accounts. Their cost per acquisition, I can't say these financial terms. Their cost per acquisition dropped by 34%. It was very successful for them. Also, this is a nice little thing here. This shows ClickBus. ClickBus, we have some fans here. They converted some of their site to AMP recently. You can see on the left over here how it was in the regular mobile site. Over that, then, how it was using AMP on their domain. The third one is AMP on the AMP cache, even faster. And the fourth is the AMP as accessed from a search engine when it loads in 0.3 seconds. So it was much faster all of a sudden. Users like speed, and their numbers also got impressive, much, much better bounce rates, 11% higher CTR. So yes, AMP can help your site out. It doesn't always, but it could. It's interesting. Also think about this too. Think about the Earth. If you're sending a lot of JavaScript, a lot of CSS, a lot of large images over the wire to people all the time, you're wasting energy for no good reason. Using electricity, all those data centers, all the networks, taking up electricity, people's computers, running all your JavaScript to render the page, it actually is bad for the Earth. So there's one more reason to consider making your site faster, however you do it, whether you use AMP, whether you use JavaScript, whatever you do. All right, so anyway, this is why AMP was created. AMP was designed to make the web better and faster, to make sites easy to make, fast to create, and also mobile friendly. So anyway, we did this actually. We built this e-commerce site with AMP, and it worked out pretty well. We learned a lot on the way. Some things were kind of hard for us to do because we didn't know how to do these things. So they weren't really hard to do, we just didn't know. So the goal of this project was to figure out how this could be done, how it could be made easier for others who want to do the same thing. Here's our site. We have 4 main pages. First of all, the home page, which should be, of course, nice and responsive, with a nice menu and nice pictures, all those kinds of things. In the upper right-hand corner, it tells you how many things are in your cart. So it's personalized a little bit. It's mostly static content, but it is somewhat personalized for the user. Then if you like this, you click on a button over there, and you go to one of these category pages. And I'm sorry also, the API we used had women's clothes and men's clothes. It's very binary. We couldn't change that, so I apologize for that. So let's say you get to a category page over here. You want to be able to go through here and select maybe shirts or shorts and filter in various ways. You want to sort by price, low to high. You want to be able to do various things like that. If you find a product that you like, you then go to the product page, which we're going to do over here any second. There's a product. And you want to be able to choose the color, customize the size, customize it in various ways. And as you choose these things, on the very bottom there, the number of things that are available should update automatically. Again, how do these things work with AMP? AMP is mostly like a low JavaScript kind of framework. How do we do all these interactions without much JavaScript? And finally, if you like the product, you add it to your cart. And there's your cart page over here. It should show what's in the user's cart, of course. Maybe you want to change things in the cart. You want to remove things, change quantities. So these are the 4 pages our site has. The home page, product listing page, a product detail page, and the cart. All right. So before I go into the project itself, you may say, well, he keeps saying this word AMP. Well, what does he mean by AMP? AMP, or whatever you want to call it. So we'll go to a brief description of what AMP is, and then we'll discuss the actual project and the tricks we used to build this site. AMP essentially is web components. Who's used web components here before in this room? Web components, anybody? A few hands go up. Essentially what this is adding new tags to HTML. HTML was invented about 30 years ago for a document description. It has tags for things like, this is a paragraph, this is boldface. There were no tags for things like, this is a Twitter embed, this is an image carousel, this is a menu. Web components let you make these functionalities by just adding more tags to your page. These are a few of the new tags that AMP adds that have functionality of various sorts. AMP uses JavaScript of its own to do this, but you're sort of discouraged from using your own JavaScript, except for in certain contexts. And actually, Philip will be talking later on about how now JavaScript is being used in AMP a lot more in about 2 hours, I think. But we didn't use this. There's this AMP script tag that allows you to use JavaScript. We didn't use this in this project. We tried to avoid writing much JavaScript on the front end, that is. So anyway, here's an example of how AMP looks. This is a YouTube embed, for example. You just say AMP YouTube, specify a layout type. AMP does various things to make your site work easily, like, for example, it makes things responsive automatically. If you choose layout equals responsive, you give it the size, you specify the ID, and there's YouTube embed. So it tries to make things easier for you, the programmer, as well as also fast for the user, because you have less JavaScript and less CSS, and things are faster in general. Another example of AMP in action over here, instead of the image tag, we're using this kind of strange-looking AMP image tag. The reason is this lets AMP control how the image actually gets used. So for example, if you have a lot of images on your site is full of images, and the user is over here on their phone, and the images that are down here, ideally, things here should load first. Things down here, images, videos, anything else should load later. Well, AMP does that for you automatically. It will lazy load the images, lazy load the JavaScript for the YouTube embed. So it tries to make sure that things that are needed now get loaded now. This is part of why you use AMP image, because then this can be controlled. It also makes sure that things pop into their spots on the screen as they're actually being loaded, and it leaves space for everything in advance. So as your page is loading, things don't pop around the screen as ads load in, as images load in. There's a space reserved for everything in advance. And other bonuses you get here as a programmer, there's a media query there inline. The source set has been modified by AMP to be more compatible around more browsers. Anyway, that's AMP in a very, very quick nutshell. If you follow the rules AMP sets out, which include JavaScript only in certain contexts, 50K of CSS or less, and a couple other rules like that, you may get a benefit of some sort. AMP is not a factor in Google search ranking, but you can see on this picture over here, there's a special little carousel in the middle. If you're a publisher, these are all AMP articles in there. And little lightning bolts appear next to those things. And these things over here get loaded from AMP's cache. So if you have valid AMP, you follow the rules of AMP, AMP has a cache that will store your HTML, and then these things get loaded from search very, very fast. In fact, in some cases, if your article appears here or your page appears here, Google search will load your page in an iframe, pre-rendered in the background. So when people tap on the link, it appears almost immediately. You saw with ClickBus before, 0.3 seconds of load. So it's a way to get this instant loading guarantee the web really should have, but doesn't usually have. Also, other companies are doing this. Here's an example of AMP in Bing. You see the same kind of carousel of articles and lightning bolts. Sorry, I'm going too fast, but I want to get to the actual project. So there's AMP. Very quickly, there's also this. There's AMP has web components, some restrictions. You want to have valid AMP pages. If you have a valid AMP page, it gets into AMP caches that serve your page very quickly if you're on various search engines pages. So a cache is nice because it makes things fast. It's a privacy-preserving way of making instant loading. But there's a bit of a problem with the cache, because if you're using an AMP cache, you're actually being served from someone else's domain, not your domain. This usually is fine, but it causes certain problems, which we'll see as we go along with this project, as we'll discuss ways to make it work on someone else's cache. This will get better hopefully soon, because signed exchanges are now a thing in Chrome. A signed exchange is essentially a way of saying, this is my content. If it's served from someone else's CDN, it's still my content. The browser knows that. It can use your domain instead of some weird Google domain or something else. This is live in Chrome right now. Other browsers aren't supporting it yet. If it becomes a web standard, the whole cache problem will be easier because you're always in your domain no matter what. But for now, You have to deal with those problems sometimes. Okay, now here's the project. After all this preamble, introduction, this is the actual thing that we did. You can go to it now. It's called camp.samples.amp.dev. That's where it lives. The code is on GitHub at this handy little link over here, go.amp.dev/camp code. That's where it lives. And here's how it started. AMP has some nice built-in templates you can download from our site over here, amp.dev. These templates have built-in design. You can use the HTML and CSS and the page structure and just start from there. So it turned out that AMP already had this built-in, or AMP already had on the site, this bike shop template that had a few pages on it and a nice-looking design. So I wanted to use this for this project. Of course, these are all just static pages, so it didn't have any real data. It was just pictures of bikes, and nothing actually worked. I wanted to convert this into a working site. So it took a little time modifying all the CSS, making things simpler in various ways, and then I wanted to get some live data. Unfortunately, I've got some friends at a place called Womp Mobile. Womp Mobile has a business making these AMP progressive web app combinations for various companies. They work in e-commerce doing AMP PWA combinations. And they gave me access to an API they already had made for a company called Campmore, which had camping equipment. So I plugged in their API and worked with the templates a little bit, and sooner or later, this bike shop became a camping shop. And there it was. We used a couple of modules here to make our job easier. In AMP in general, you have less JavaScript on the front end, so you have more logic on the back end. And a good build process is part of that, making CSS small, doing various things. We won't discuss most of those things now. There'll be articles on these coming up pretty soon on amp.dev. We'll have various guides how we did this coming out next month. Until then, some modules that were useful. This here came out of this project. We made this to make our jobs easier. It's called AMP HTML AutoScript. AMP relies on JavaScript to make various web components work. So you have to include script tags for all of the components that you use. But keeping track of that can be hard sometimes. This module is simply a gulp plugin that scans your HTML, looks for the relevant AMP components, and includes all the JavaScript automatically. We found this very useful, made our jobs easier as programmers. Another useful module here is AMP Validator. We use this to make sure our AMP pages were always valid as part of our build process. So if a page became invalid AMP, we would know that and be able to correct whatever error there was. Also, we use this thing over here, AMP Project Toolbox Optimizer. This makes it better to have AMP pages on your origin. It does various optimizations to the HTML on your origin. Some things the AMP cache does to make things faster, or the AMP runtime does to make things faster. This will do over here server side. Also quite useful. Anyway, what I'm going to do now in our remaining time is go through the 4 pages of the site and point out a couple tricks we use for each of these 4 pages. And on the way, we'll learn how to make interactive AMP sites too. So first of all, the home page. The first page you get to in some cases. It should be beautiful. It should be an attractive page. It should be responsive. It's mostly static. So this is the kind of content AMP usually is known for, static content, some basic functionality, social sharing, menus, those kinds of things. One thing, though, here is personalized, which is this little guy in the far right-hand corner. This should show the number of items in your cart. So if you've used the site before and come back to the site, either on your own domain or on an AMP cache, it should show you the number of things in the cart. How does this work with no JavaScript? Well, we use 2 components that work well together. One is called AMP List. AMP List is the component that essentially does a call to your API, an XHR request, and gets data back. It wants to get JSON back. That JSON then gets plugged into a mustache template, and it gets formatted. So server call, JSON comes back, and then formatted via a mustache template. Here's how it looks. It's pretty straightforward. Does this work? It doesn't work. There's AMP List over there. You can see there's the SRC attribute that indicates where the request gets made. There's our API on our server there, API cart count. On the bottom, you can see an example of JSON that gets returned. It's just an object here. The important part is count equals 1. And then when the AMP gets that back, it plugs into this template over here. There's your mustache template. And the little pound count, you probably know it means if count exists and is non-zero and is not falsy, then go ahead and display that span showing the count. If it is 0 or falsy, don't show anything. This works out quite nicely. If you have one thing, for example, it shows a 1. If you have no things, it shows nothing. So there it is. Basically no logic on the front end at all, except for a little bit of mustache logic, and there's your number of things in the cart. You may miss writing JavaScript for these things, and JavaScript is fun and great. We use it a lot in the server and some on the client, but in this case, it's just kind of easier to do it this way, I think. We found this very maintainable. So there's something. However, if you're on an AMP cache, you're on a different domain, and one problem you might face is that if you're making an XHR request from an AMP cache domain to your domain, it's actually a cross-origin request, which might get blocked by the browser. There's a good solution for this, though. A standard solution, you simply add certain headers to the request, and the server recognizes certain domains as being legitimate. This is called CORS, cross-origin requests, something or other, CORS. And there's guidance on this if you want on our site at this little link over here, go.amp.dev/CORS. You also can just use this handy module over here. It's middleware, AMP Toolbox CORS. Does all the hard work for you. So CORS requests aren't really a problem. What can be a problem is that certain browsers, you probably know, will block third-party cookies. And if a request comes from an AMP cache, and you want to get a cookie from your domain, the browser might say, wait, you're actually ampproject.org or google.com, or you're from Bing. You're not actually your site.com. We can't show the cookie with you. If you have a session cookie, you can't see it then. This can be a problem. In this case, we decided that if you're on an AMP cache, it wasn't a big deal to just not show the number of things in the cart. Ideally, you could. If you didn't, though, the fact is your next click or next tap is going to return to your domain. All the links point to your domain. So they don't know what's in their cart right now. If they go press any button over here, they get the cart next, because on your own domain, of course, cookies are fine. So not ideal, not a big deal. We thought maybe it's worth the sacrifice. Actually, it turns out that it works in Safari right now anyway. So browsers are not blocking our cookies. I'm not sure why, but it seems to work. So anyway, that was good. Next, the product listing page. If you get to your home page and like something there, you click on something and look for product listings. So here, you want to be able to sort and filter things. You want to be able to filter, in this case, by gender of the clothing or by shirts or shorts, and sort by price, high to low, low to high. How do these things work without as much logic on the client? We use something called AMP bind. If you have used Angular or other popular frameworks, binding will be familiar to you. There's 3 main steps here with AMP bind. The state, so you have an application state, bind, a binding step, and then a mutation step where you change something, there's a binding in the DOM, and the change propagates into the DOM. So we use this technique to actually make an API call, which is kind of complicated, but kind of cool. Once you do it, it feels very natural. Here's how it works. First of all, an application state is set. So in this case, it comes from our server, thus those little template things over there. You have a gender and a category of the clothing, and then a filter, either high to low or low to high. So this is our state variable. It's called products. Next, this should also be familiar to you mostly. This is an event binding. So we use the on attribute, and when that's selected over there, it changes to shirts or shorts, for example, or I guess in this case, sorry. When it changes from high to low or low to high, AMP fires an event called change. When that change event is detected, we use AMP set state to change our state variable, to change the value of the filter property to match what you've done as a user. So if the user selects high to low, for example, that filter property will then contain the value high to low. And then finally, there's the mutation step. We also have bound over here an expression to the src attribute over here. Notice there's 2 attributes here. The bottom one here, src, is where the API call happens initially. But then the one above it is in brackets. AMP recognizes the thing in brackets as a binding. So we've bound that expression there to the src attribute. And then if the value of product changes, the expression gets reevaluated, and that then will change and trigger a new API call. And that's how it works. Some examples are down there of 2 different API calls you can see. it will just change the parameters there to high-low or low-high, the gender, the shirts or shorts, whatever, based on the value of those variables over there. There you go. Sorting and filtering, again, pretty easy to do. Third page over here out of 4, the product detail page. Let's look at that for a minute. So in this product detail page over here, it's the best practice in e-commerce, I'm told, to get price information fresh and availability fresh, because maybe you want to get this shirt, maybe they're all sold out, maybe the price has changed, so you want to have those things gotten from the server right when the user requests the page. So our goal here is to render this page on the server and then to pull these things over here from the server with amp list. The problem we had, though, is if you have multiple things to request, amp list controls a part of the page. So if you want to request 2 things, or 3 things, or 5 things across the page, you have to have multiple amp list calls. But you want to make one call, really. You want to make one call, get all the data, put it in at once. So how does AMP do that? It turns out AMP is smart about these things. It tries to make things easier for you and faster in general. So, right, maybe you're afraid of this thing, but don't be afraid, because there's a thing called XHR batching. If AMP sees the same request made multiple times, it makes the request once, not multiple times. So it's all transparent. Use AMP list over there, use it over there, and you can see over here the result. 1 request was made, not 2 requests, not 3 or 4. So that's all well and good. Adding to cart, also an interesting interaction over here. Here we use 2 different things together, amp bind and amp form. So one complication here can be if you're on the cache. Here's how a request might look usually from this kind of situation. So we make a post request to do an add to cart to our API. In e-commerce, a post is more secure than a get. And then AMP adds something called AMP same origin true. AMP adds this extra header if you're on your origin. If you're on the cache, the header doesn't get added. So this is your origin case over here. There's your cookie, and there is a product ID. So this is an easy change to make. The server gets this data, it gets your cookie, it gets your cart, makes the change, all is good. However, on an AMP cache, then it won't add that header. So you just get the cookie, product ID, and nothing else, because you're not on your origin anymore. This is fine. But remember, certain browsers will block third-party cookies. So on certain browsers, on the cache, you get just this. You get the request add to cart, product ID, and nothing else. So now you're kind of stuck. You have no cookie, you don't know who they are, you can't do this. Or can you? It turns out AMP has a way to do this too. There's a magical thing called AMP redirect to. What we're going to do here is use this extra header to move the user off of the cache onto your domain. Once you're on domain, everything is easy because you control your domain, cookies are yours, and all of that. So the way this works is as follows. And I'm running out of time. It might go sort of fast here, which I apologize for. You make a request to add to the cart over here, the product ID. The server then says, OK, if there's cookies, then we're all set. It's easy. If there's no AMP same origin header, though, that means that we're on the cache. If we're on the cache and there are no cookies, then probably they're being blocked. So our goal is to go back to our origin. If there's no cookies and there is a header, it means there's just a new user on your origin. You give them a cookie, and you go on from there. But let's say you get this case over here. You can't read the cookies. You're on the cache. What do? You simply return AMP redirect to. And notice we're doing here is taking the mutation there from the post and converting that into query parameters for a GET request. So it sends this back to the browser. AMP will see this and say, oh, OK, we're going to redirect. And it redirects to your origin to the actual site we've requested over here. Then we make the request again from your origin. At this point, you're on your origin. You can read cookies. Everything is good. The server gets this. It makes the change to the cart, and then does one more redirect, basically just removing the query parameter. So there's kind of 2 redirects over here. By the end of the process, you're back on your origin, and you've got your cart, and all is good. So this can be done, and we actually managed to do it. It worked OK. Finally, the cart page, the very last thing over here. Our 4th page. In some cases, again, you're being blocked. You can't read the cookies. But in that case, it's not really a big deal, we decided, because you don't often search for a cart page anyway. I don't go search for someone's cart page. So what we did then is just figured we would not cache the cart page ever, because the cart page is dynamic anyway. It can't really be cached. It isn't searched for anyway. So we just do a trivial invalidation thing over here, or tell robots.txt not to crawl this page. Your cart page is safe from all these things happening. I had a final example here about removing a cart item, but we're kind of running out of time, so I'll skip that. Look at the code if you're curious. Essentially, this involves combining amp list, amp bind, and amp form. What you do is the cart is built by a server call, an amp list, and then a binding occurs. You have an invisible form that sends the request back to the server, and then it all works out nicely. That's all I have really to talk about. So for AMP-free commerce, is it for you? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You see there are some complications involved with using the cache, but you get some benefits as well, because the cache is more complicated, but also things are just faster for the user. So it can be good for your company or for your business. And also one advantage is that once you're done, your code is very, very simple and easy to maintain. Our code has very, very few dependencies. All we depend on is AMP to work. As long as AMP is still working, our code's going to work. It's kind of simple and kind of elegant. So give it a try, see what you think. There's various ways to make a fast site. AMP is one of those ways that we think is kind of a way that persists. It doesn't tend to regress, as performance often does. You can try it out, see what you think. If you're curious, go to amp.dev, check it out, see what you think. And that's me on Twitter, on top there. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. Amazing
thank
talk.
you.
Amazing talk.